6 weeks before anyone came to apologize, Nora Callahan was already paying the price for a decision nobody in Harlan Crossing could understand. The wagon moved slowly down the center of the main road, its wheels cutting dark lines through the morning mud. Resting in the wagon bed, wrapped in canvas and rope, sat a full-length hand-augered well casing 40 feet of iron pipe, threaded joint by joint, packed in sections across the wagon floor. The load was heavy enough that the rear axle bowed slightly with every rut. People stopped walking to watch. A few leaned against the post office railing. One man stepped out of the land office and shielded his eyes against the June sun. A young widow with a homestead claim and $200 to her name, someone said, had no business buying well pipe. There was a perfectly usable creek running along the south edge of her property. There was spring runoff every March. There was common sense. And then there was whatever Nora Callahan had decided to do with her money. Nora heard the remark. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. What nobody in Harlan Crossing understood that June afternoon was that the sky had been keeping a secret for longer than any of them realized, and that 40 feet of iron pipe, dragged through ridicule and mud, would one day be the only thing standing between the valley and ruin. Before she ever reached Harlan Crossing, Nora Callahan had already survived one ending. Her husband Thomas had died of a fever in the spring of 1887, 11 months after they had filed a joint claim on a stretch of flat grassland in the Drywater Basin of eastern Colorado. What he left behind was a half-finished cabin, a team of 2 horses named Buck and Ida, a small debt to a seed merchant in Pueblo, and a homestead law that said the land could still belong to her if she proved it for the remaining 4 years. She was 24 years old. The advice came quickly and without invitation. Her sister in Missouri wrote that she should abandon the claim and come east. The county land agent told her that single women rarely held dry ground claims past 2 seasons. A neighbor named Garrett Pell, who ran the largest cattle operation in the basin, offered to buy out her claim at 60 cents an acre, which he described as generous, and which Nora declined without explanation. What she did instead was study. Thomas had kept a journal, not of feelings or memories, but of observations, soil depth, wind direction by month, the behavior of his horses in different weather, how the grass moved before a storm versus after one. Nora had read that journal more times than she could count. Somewhere between February and April of her first year alone, she began keeping her own. The creek that ran along her south boundary was what everyone else saw as her water supply. It was shallow, fast-moving, and reliable in the way that made people comfortable. It had not failed in living memory. It ran clear every spring and slowed to a thin ribbon in August, but always recovered by October. Nobody worried about it. Nora worried about it. Her journal recorded something the neighbors did not discuss. In the 3 summers before Thomas died, the creek had arrived later each March. The ribbon in August had grown thinner each year. The recovery in October had taken longer. Nobody else seemed to be writing these things down. Nobody else seemed to notice that the sky over the basin had been delivering slightly less rain with each passing season, the way a lamp turns down so gradually that the room seems unchanged until suddenly it is dark. She spent most of the winter reading everything she could find about groundwater. She borrowed a surveying text from the county office and returned it 6 weeks later with her own notes tucked between the pages. She wrote letters to a geological survey office in Denver and received, after 2 months, a detailed response that she read 4 times before folding it carefully and placing it in Thomas's journal. The letter confirmed what the creek had been trying to tell her. Beneath the Drywater Basin lay a substantial aquifer, old water, deep water, patient water, that had nothing to do with yearly rainfall. The surface creek depended on snowmelt and sky. The aquifer depended on neither. A well drilled to the right depth would reach water that no drought could touch. The well pipe cost her $190. It left her with almost nothing. She sold the extra saddle, Thomas's good coat, and a silver brooch her mother had given her at her wedding. She kept the horses. She kept the journal. She kept the pipe. When the wagon carrying it rolled down the main street of Harlan Crossing on its way to her claim, the laughter followed her for 3 blocks. Getting the pipe to the claim was only the first problem. The second problem was considerably deeper. Hand-augering a well 40 feet into hard eastern Colorado ground was not work designed for one person. The equipment required leverage, and leverage required either a strong frame or a strong partner. Nora had neither. What she had was a block-and-tackle system she had purchased from a retiring freighter named Old Dell, a diagram she had copied by hand from the Geological Survey Office's booklet, and an understanding of mechanical advantage that she had taught herself from a borrowed engineering primer. She built the tripod frame herself over 3 days, using lumber she had negotiated from the sawmill in exchange for 2 weeks of bookkeeping work. The posts were set deep and braced with angle iron. The pulley hung exactly where the diagram said it should. The auger bit, borrowed from a well driller 2 counties away who owed a favor to a man who owed a favor to Old Dell, was heavier than it looked. The work began on a Monday morning in late June with the temperature already climbing toward 90 degrees. By Wednesday, she had gone 6 feet. By the following Monday, she had reached 14 feet and hit a layer of dense caliche that turned the auger bit sideways and sent her sprawling across the frame hard enough to leave a bruise along her left forearm that lasted 2 weeks. She reset the bit. She adjusted the angle. She went back down. Garrett Pell rode past on Thursday of that week and stopped his horse near the tripod. He looked at the frame, at the pipe sections laid out in order beside the hole, at Nora standing in the sun with her hair pinned back and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. "Waste of good ground," he said. "Water's in the creek." Nora looked up at him briefly. She had learned something in her first year alone that nobody had taught her directly. Men who offer opinions about your work without being asked are usually telling you something about their own fear, not your mistake. She went back to the auger. Pell watched for another minute. Then he rode away. The work continued. By the 3rd week of July, she had reached 22 feet, and the walls of the shaft had begun to show something different. The soil changed color. The texture changed. The auger brought up material that was darker, cooler to the touch, and faintly damp, in a way that the surface ground was not. Nora crouched at the edge of the shaft and held her palm above the opening. A faint coolness touched her skin, rising from somewhere far below. She did not say anything. She simply stood up and went back to work. The water arrived at 31 feet. Not a flood, not a gush. A slow, dark seep that crept up the shaft wall during the night and sat there by morning, still and quiet, as if it had always been there, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right place. Nora stood at the edge of the shaft in the early light and looked down at it for a long time. Then she lowered a tin cup on a string. The water was cold. It had a faint mineral taste and no smell at all. She drank the entire cup standing there at the edge of the shaft and poured a second one for herself before she thought to sit down. She finished the casing installation over the next 4 days, setting each pipe section and packing the joints with lead wool until the column was solid from surface to aquifer. She built a simple wooden crib around the wellhead and fitted a hand pump she had ordered from a catalog 3 months earlier, paying for it before the pipe, before the lumber, before almost anything else, because she believed in buying the thing that mattered first and figuring out the rest later. The neighbors noticed the pump. Some of them said nothing. Some of them asked practical questions she was glad to answer. Miriam Ashford, from the next claim east, came over one afternoon with a jar of pickled beets and spent an hour watching the pump work. "Looks like it holds," Miriam said. "Holds 31 feet, Nora said. Miriam looked at the pump. She looked at the horizon. She looked back at the pump. "That's deep," she said. Nora nodded. "That's the point." By September, the basin was still green in places, which reassured most people. The creek still ran. The cattle still drank. The hay still came in, lighter than usual, but enough to feel manageable. Garrett Pell had the largest water rights in the basin and the longest memory of good seasons. He saw no reason for alarm. He had managed every drought this basin had thrown at him. He told people at the feed store, and a dry summer in the 80s was hardly worth discussing. Nora read her journal. She did not share what she read. The fall came on hard and early that year. October skies turned the color of old tin. The grass went from green to yellow to brown in a span of 3 weeks that moved so quickly through the basin that most people had not finished noting it before it was done. Nora's horses began behaving differently in late October. Buck, the calmer of the two, started drinking more than usual at the pump. Ida grew restless in the mornings and stood near the well rather than grazing. Nora added an entry to the journal about it, then added another one 2 days later when she noticed that the creek had gone quieter than it had any business going in mid-autumn. She walked down to the south boundary on a Saturday afternoon and crouched at the bank. The water moved slowly. The depth was wrong for October. She pushed a stick into the stream bed and noted where the water line hit. Then she walked back to the cabin and wrote the measurement down. She already had measurements from September, and August, and July. The stick measurements formed a line that went in only one direction. That evening, she called her hired hand, a quiet 17-year-old named Jesse, who had come to her claim looking for work in May and stayed because she paid on time and fed him well. She told him what she had seen in the creek. She told him about the aquifer. She told him what she thought the coming season was going to look like. Jesse listened without speaking. He was the kind of young man who believed in waiting until he understood something before he responded to it. When she finished, he said, "How bad?" Nora looked at the journal. "Bad enough." She told him to begin hauling water from the well to the cattle tank every morning, whether the creek showed weakness or not. She told him to bring the water barrels inside the barn and fill them to the top and keep them there. She told him to say nothing about it to anyone in town. Jesse nodded and went to fill the first barrel. The winter that followed was dry rather than cold. No blizzard, no ice storm, no howling drama sweeping down from the north. Just a gray sky that sat over the Drywater Basin month after month and gave back almost nothing. December passed without meaningful snow. January brought 3 small dustings that melted within a day and left the ground no better than before. February arrived with wind that was drier than any February anyone could remember. The creek began to fail in mid-February. It did not fail all at once. That was the dangerous part. It narrowed gradually, the way an argument narrows when one side simply stops adding to it. First the edges went, the shallow margins that had always been unreliable. Then the center slowed. The current, which had always given the creek its sense of permanence and health, began to feel more like suggestion than fact. Most families in the basin did not notice immediately. They had been watching the creek the way people watch something they trust, not carefully, but continuously. The way you watch a clock when you believe it is keeping correct time. By the first week of March, the creek at the south boundary of Nora's claim was 4 inches deep at its deepest point and could be crossed in 3 steps without getting a boot wet. Nora measured it on a Wednesday morning and compared the stick measurement to the one from October. She was not surprised. She had been watching the line in the journal for 8 months. Garrett Pell noticed the creek first, around the middle of March, because his cattle operation depended on it in a way that made ignoring it impossible. He rode out to his water intake point on a Monday morning expecting a familiar sight, and found instead a trickle moving through a channel 3 times too wide for it. He stood there for several minutes before riding back toward town. By late March, the situation had become the main subject of conversation at the feed store, at the post office, and outside the doors of the small church where the Basin families gathered on Sundays. People offered explanations. A late spring thaw was coming. An unusual year. The runoff would restore it. The basin had seen dry stretches before, and the creek had always recovered. Nora did not attend these conversations. She was too busy. She had spent the winter expanding the well system. A second pump had been installed at the barn. A series of wooden troughs ran downhill from the wellhead to the cattle tank, using gravity to move water without requiring Jesse to carry it by hand. The indoor water barrels were full. The animals had been watered from the well exclusively for 6 weeks. Nothing on her claim depended on the creek anymore. She had not announced any of this. The basin did not ask. By April, the creek was gone. Not diminished, not sluggish. Gone. The channel sat empty and pale under a colorless sky, and the people who had depended on it stood at its banks and faced a problem that had no comfortable explanation. The late thaw did not arrive. The spring runoff was a rumor. The usual recovery simply did not happen, because what the basin was experiencing was not a bad season. It was the consequence of 7 years of declining rainfall arriving all at once in the only form that could not be ignored. The first person to come to Nora's claim was not Garrett Pell. It was Miriam Ashford, who arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-April, leading her milk cow on a rope because the stock pond behind her cabin had gone to cracked mud, and she had 2 children who needed milk and no other idea of what to do. She came quietly, the way a person arrives when they are embarrassed and grateful at the same time and cannot figure out which feeling deserves more of their face. Nora saw her coming from 50 yards out. She had the second pump running before Miriam reached the gate. Miriam didn't say much. She let the cow drink until the animal raised its head on its own. Then she looked at the wellhead and the pipe casing and the gravity troughs and the full barrels in the barn doorway, and she stood there taking it in the way a person takes in something they should have asked about a long time ago. "How long have you had all of this?" she asked. "Since July," Nora said. Miriam absorbed that. July. She had come over in September with a jar of pickled beets and watched the pump work and said it looked like it held and gone home. 7 months had passed. She helped herself to a second pail from the pump and carried it to the cow without asking permission. Nora did not mind. That was the Wednesday. By Friday, the word had moved through the basin the way true need always travels, not through gossip but through necessity. The Harmon family arrived with 3 horses and a mule, and said almost nothing beyond, "Where do we bring them?" And Nora showed them the trough. Young Etta Vane from the North Claim came on foot carrying an empty butter churn and asked if she could fill it and was already filling it before the question finished. By Saturday afternoon, Garrett Pell's wagon appeared at the gate. He did not come down the road with the easy posture of a man who owned the most cattle in the basin. He came the way a person arrives when size has stopped being a protection. He tied his horse at the post and stood outside the gate for a moment that was long enough to mean something. Nora was at the pump. She did not stop working. She did not walk toward him. She waited. He came through the gate and walked to the pump and looked at it the way he had looked at the tripod 18 months earlier. The same deliberate eyes, the same weighing, but something in the calculation had changed. In June of the previous year, his cattle had the creek, and he had the confidence that goes with it. Now his cattle had nothing, and she had water, and the arithmetic was different. He said, "I've got 230 head. Nora set down the pail she was holding. She did not say, "I told you." She did not revisit the morning on the road when the wagon with the pipe had rolled past, and the laughter had followed it down the block. Those words would have cost her something she was not willing to spend. She said, "The trough holds about what you need. Bring them in from the south gate." Pell looked at her. Whatever he had expected her to say, that was not it. He nodded once and went back to his horse. In the days that followed, the well at Nora Callahan's claim became the center of the basin's survival, the way a fire becomes the center of a room in cold weather, not because anyone planned it, but because warmth goes where warmth is, and need goes where supply is. And there was only one place in the Drywater Basin where the ground was still giving water. Nora organized it. She could not have explained exactly when she shifted from managing her own supply to managing the basin's, but at some point the two things became the same. She drew up a watering schedule on the back of a feed invoice and tacked it to the gatepost so that no 2 large herds arrived at the same time. Jessie worked the pump from first light until noon. Nora worked it from noon until dark. On the days when the line of animals and people stretched past the gate, she sent Jessie for water from the indoor barrels to keep the trough full between pump cycles. She charged nothing. Nobody offered to pay. That was not the arrangement. What they offered instead was labor. Tom Harmon reshod both of her horses without asking. The Vane family rebuilt the broken section of her south fence that she had not had time to fix since October. Miriam Ashford brought food 3 times a week and stayed to help with whatever needed doing. The currency of the dry season was not money. It was the only thing the basin had left to trade. Even Garrett Pell sent 2 of his ranch hands to help dig a secondary runoff channel that directed stormwater, if any ever came, toward the wellhead catchment. The work took 4 days. It improved a system that had not asked for improvement. Pell did not come himself, but he sent the men, and he sent them early, and he sent them fed. Jessie noticed the change before Nora said anything about it. One evening, sitting on the porch after the last animals had been watered and the pump was quiet, he said, "They treat you different now." Nora looked at the pump handle, catching the last of the evening light. "They see the water," she said. Jessie thought about that. Then he said, "What did they see before?" Nora considered the question. The June road, the wagon, the pipe wrapped in canvas, the laughter. A woman making a decision that was too heavy to explain, she said. The drought broke in the second week of May. It did not break dramatically. There was no single storm that restored the creek and announced that the crisis had ended. Instead, rain came in 3 separate systems over 10 days, each one modest, each one adding carefully to what the ground was willing to accept. The creek stirred first at its source up in the hills and worked its way down to the basin slowly, feeling its way forward like something that had forgotten its path and was remembering it section by section. By the third week of May, water ran in the channel again. Not strongly, not with any of the old confidence, but it ran. The basin began to separate back into itself. Animals returned to their own pastures. Families returned to their own routines. The gathering at Nora's gate thinned over a few days to occasional visits, and then to none. Most people left quietly. Some of them stopped at the pump before they left and said something brief that was trying to carry more weight than it was built for. Nora accepted what they said without making it difficult for them. Jessie replaced the worn pump leather and repacked 2 of the pipe joints that had loosened slightly under weeks of heavy use. The trough was cleaned. The troughs were drained and dried and ready for ordinary use again. The barn barrels were refilled. The gravity system was adjusted and improved in 2 places where the angle had not been quite right. She stood at the wellhead on the first morning in June when no one else came through the gate and looked at the pump handle and the pipe casing and the crib she had built around the top of the shaft, and she thought about the morning 14 months earlier when she had hauled all of it down the main street of Harlan Crossing, and the comments had followed her 3 blocks. She did not feel righteous about it. She felt something quieter than that. 2 mornings later, she found a lumber delivery at her gate before sunrise. Good milled timber, enough to finish the second room of the cabin she had been building toward since Thomas died. No note, no name on the order. The team tracks in the mud went back toward town and told her everything she needed. She stood at the gate for a moment before beginning to unload it herself. In June, new entries appeared in the county land agent's order books. Well casing, pump fittings, drilling equipment. Garrett Pell placed the largest order. He asked no advice from anyone and gave no explanation for the change. He simply ordered what he needed and arranged for a well driller to come out before summer settled over the basin again. The creek continued to run that summer. It was thinner than the old settlers remembered, and nobody who had grown up along its banks quite trusted it the way they once had. That was perhaps the most honest outcome, not that the creek failed, but that people finally saw it as something that could. Miriam Ashford changed too. She began keeping a notebook, not of feelings or memories, but of observations. Water level in the stock pond, soil moisture near the east fence, how the grass moved before a dry wind versus an ordinary one. She did not mention the notebook to anyone for several months. When she finally showed it to Nora one afternoon in August, Nora read the first 3 pages without speaking. Good measurements, she said. Miriam looked at the notebook. I started it in March, she said. I should have started it years ago. Nora handed it back. Most people should, she said. That's not a failure. That's just how learning arrives. Jessie stayed on at the claim through the second winter and into the following spring, by which point he was no longer a hired hand in any practical sense, but something closer to a partner in the operation, a fact that neither of them discussed formally because the daily work had already settled it without needing words. The pump never stopped working. 31 feet down, the aquifer continued doing what aquifers do, which is hold water through the seasons in a way that has nothing to do with the sky's generosity or mood. It was old water down there. Nora had read that in the Geological Survey letter the first time, but she understood it differently now than she had then. Old water meant patient water. It meant water that had been waiting before any claim was filed, before any creek was named, before anyone in the Drywater Basin had decided what to trust. The well did not save her because it was right. It saved her because she had believed in it long enough to finish digging. There was a distinction there that was easy to miss. Preparation was not prediction. She had not known with certainty that the drought would come in that year, in that season, at that particular intensity. What she had known was what the journal showed her, which was that the creek was moving in one direction over time, and that direction did not favor waiting. She had acted on the evidence before the evidence became a crisis. That was the whole of it, not cleverness, not stubbornness, not luck, just a decision made early enough that the difficulty of making it did not feel like heroism, only like work. The following spring, Clara Ashford, Miriam's eldest daughter, who had been 8 years old during the drought and had spent 3 weeks watching the basin's animals come through Nora's gate to drink, asked her mother why Mrs. Callahan had dug the well before anyone else. Miriam thought about it for a moment. Because she was watching something the rest of us decided not to look at, she said. Clara considered that. What was she watching? Miriam glanced toward the south, where the creek ran its uncertain course toward the basin floor. The water we had, she said. And how long it was going to stay. Nora Callahan remained on the claim for the rest of her life. She drilled a second well 11 years later when the aquifer in the northern quarter of the property proved even more productive than the first. She kept the journal Thomas had started and filled 7 more volumes herself over the years. And every volume contained the same kind of entries, measurements, observations, patterns. The slow and unglamorous evidence of a world that was always trying to tell people something if they were willing to sit with it long enough. She never made a speech about what the drought had meant. Nobody asked her to. The work spoke for what it needed to say, which was not very much, which was exactly enough. She trained 3 women in the basin to read water tables and soil moisture over the years that followed. Women who had watched the drought arrive and decided they preferred to understand the ground they stood on. 2 of them became the most reliable dry land farmers in the county. The third moved to Denver and wrote a pamphlet on groundwater management that was used by 2 counties as a reference for the next decade. The pump at the first well eventually wore out and was replaced. The replacement wore out in turn and was replaced again. The pipe casing held for 40 years before it needed to be relined. The wellhead crib was rebuilt twice. Some things endure by being replaced carefully rather than by never changing. The aquifer remained. 31 feet down, the old water sat in the dark the way it always had, patient and cold and indifferent to seasons, waiting for the next hand willing to go deep enough and ask. The most useful preparation you will ever make is the kind nobody applauds while you are doing it. Nora did not dig her well because she knew disaster was coming. She dug it because she was honest enough to read what the evidence was quietly saying. You do not need certainty to act wisely. You only need the patience to watch carefully and the courage to begin before anyone else thinks it is necessary. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, shared here for your entertainment, and to carry a small, sincere lesson about the quiet power of preparation and paying attention to the world around us.